Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Tom Snyder, Senior Director, Transition Services for Henry Schein Dental Practice Transitions. Thank you for joining me today for what I hope to be a very informative webinar about practice sales and your plans for the coming year or shortly thereafter. So what we're going to cover today is I want you to understand our dental landscape because I'm sure most of you know we've had a lot of changes in our profession. I've been in the profession for a long time, seen just about everything, and the trends are important for you to know because they can have an impact on your practice transition plans, without a doubt. Also, we're going to determine what key questions you need to answer yourself to successfully execute your transition plan. We're going to talk about using a practice broker for those of you who are planning on selling. And we'll talk about the major components of a practice purchase agreement, which is like a bill of sale, but there are lots of component parts, and it's important to understand these things. Plus, there's a few other points we'll be covering as well. It's hard to believe that 2023 is just about over, and we're facing a new year. As we all know, lots going on in our world. We have an election coming up next year. We still have uncertainty on the economy. We don't know where interest rates are going to plateau. We don't know if there's going to be a recession. And we all know there certainly is some instability in our world. But that shouldn't deter you from making your own plans for your future. I'm sure some of you who are joining this session today are just to kind of hear what I have to say, some of the points that I'm making. And maybe you're really not thinking of selling your practice for the foreseeable future. So I'll talk about a few points that will address for those folks who maybe are thinking of doing it, not so much now, but maybe in a few years. But more importantly, if you really are attending this program with the intention of selling your practice in 2024, we need to get started now. I think you'll understand when we finish our talk today why it's so critical to get things in motion. So let's look at our dental landscape. As I said, I've been in this game a long time and seen lots of changes. And what we do find, though, is still the majority of our dentists practice at single locations. You know, we know there's a lot of group practices, lots of DSOs, which I'll talk about in a while, but majority of dentists still practice in one location. Now, practicing one location, they may have an associate, but that's really our landscape now. However, that is really starting to change. And where we see a big change is in solo practice. When I graduated from dental school, about 90% of my classmates wanted to be solo practitioners. That was the norm. As a matter of fact, admissions officers looked at characteristics of individuals who like to work by themselves. So they thought that they would make a good dentist. Well, that's really been changing the last couple of generations, to be honest with you. And if you look at 2015, about 50% of dentists were in solo practice. Now, for definitional purposes, a solo practitioner is one doctor only in one location. Whereas before I mentioned we have a number of dentists who are working at one location, but there may be two or three at that one location. So when I talk about solos, it's one doc, one location. In 2022, we've seen a tremendous decrease. 36% of all dentists are now classified as solo practitioners. But here's where it gets interesting. If we look at the age of dentists, we see that this characteristic is quite age-specific. For example, for those of you who graduated 25 years or more from dental school, 50% of you are still solo. That's a significant number. And for many of you, you're hoping that you will find someone to purchase your practice. More than likely, it'll be another individual who will purchase your practice unless you have the ability to grow and have more patients that you can handle as an individual practitioner. But here's the real trend. If we look at graduates up to 10 years out of dental school, only 17% were solo. So what that means is we're looking at the supply of doctors who want to be a solo practitioner, which certainly isn't an overwhelming number. And if you're a solo practitioner, you need to understand these numbers and facts, because that may have an impact on the number of individuals who may be interested in buying your solo practice. Also, as we know, as I mentioned earlier, we have more and more group practices being formed. And if we look at graduates 10 years from graduation, 24% are affiliated with practices having 10 or more locations. So clearly, practice modalities are a major shift that will continue to do so. However, for those of you who are on this call tonight to think about selling, you need to know that it's a seller's market in most areas of the country. And that's because there's still a lot more purchasers out there who want to buy a practice. So we sometimes have bidding wars when we sell our dental practices for our clients because they're desirable and people are willing to pay even a higher price than maybe the value that was ascribed to it. So given that, practice values are continuing to be at peak levels. So and we're going to reference that in a few minutes too, to see where practice values are on a nationwide basis. As I said before, there are more purchasers than sellers, and the average retirement age is beginning to drop a little bit. Now, the American Dental Association's Health Policy Institute, which many of you may have been taking some of their webinars, or maybe involved in some of their survey research, they expect a surge of baby boomers to retire in the next 5 years. And that's easily understandable because if you look at this graph, on the lower left, you will see a graph that shows doctors over the age of 65. In 2010, only 11.3% of doctors were 65 or over. But as of 2020, 16.3% of doctors are 65 and older. So we have a lot of doctors out there who are ready to go. I'm sure a number of you in that category thinking about next year or shortly thereafter. Consolidation keeps increasing, and it's increasing at an accelerated rate. In 2019, 10.4% of U.S. dentists were affiliated with DSOs. Today, 13% of dentists are affiliated with DSOs. So that number keeps increasing. We've seen shifts in DSOs as far as the type of practices they're looking for, the type of relationships they want to have with their sellers. And so many DSOs are shifting to what's called a partnership model, where they don't necessarily buy you out completely, like we'll be talking about most of today in a private sale basis, but you end up working with this group and have some type of affiliation where there could be a potential benefit down the road. So that is very attractive to many doctors. As a matter of fact, we find more and more DSOs are looking at doctors in their 40s and 50s, maybe even in their 30s if they've been successful, because they want to keep you for a while. Back in the day when DSOs came out of the gate, they were really focusing on doctors who were a little bit older. But when those doctors retired, it might have taken 2 replacement associates to take the place of a highly producing solo practitioner that DSO bought. So a lot of them learned their lesson and said, well, you know what? We've got to create incentives. We've got to create a way that we keep our doctors on. So hence the shift to partnership model for many of them. Also, we noticed there is a change in what we call post-sale employment when you sell to a DSO. If you sell to a DSO, you just don't leave after settlement like you can in a private sale. You're obligated to work with them. Originally, it used to be 2 years. Then it rated up to 3. Now it's 4 or 5 years. So again, when you look at your transition plans and where you want to be in the next number of years, if you want to retire in a year or two, then maybe a DSO isn't what is going to really satisfy your needs because they want you to stay around longer. Now, that's not always the case, depending if there are other doctors in the practice that it may be able to be an exception to the rule. But for the most part, it's a longer employment term. Now, our dental graduates are changing too. What we're noticing trends for a number of doctors now who don't want to own a dental practice. Back in the day when 90% of doctors wanted to be solo practitioners, the majority of them wanted to own their own business. It was the solo entrepreneur model. Well, that's not the case today. As a matter of fact, again, from the ADA Health Policy Institute, we see that about 60% of females owned a practice in 2021, and about 80% of males owned a practice. So that means as we move into the future, we have less doctors who are really looking at ownership, at least in the short term. And part of that might be due to the fact of the enormous amount of cost for dental education. But we also find that the younger generation is 3 times more likely to seek employment in large groups than they were 10 years ago. As a matter of fact, the class of 2022, 35% of them plan to join a DSO. So it's where we are, and things are changing. But, for your planning purposes, it's important to know that in certain markets, there may not be as many dentists who are interested in buying your practice because not as many people want to be owners, or they want to be solo practitioners particularly. And just to give you an idea, we all know dental education is very expensive. The average debt of the class of 2022 was $286,000. But interestingly enough, 19% had no debt. Still today, as it's been for a number of years, the majority of recent grads prefer to practice and live in urban and suburban areas. And obviously, that means there's more competition for these practices because more doctors living there. So when a doctor wants to put his or her practice up for sale in these types of markets, we do get a lot of competition, and hence sometimes really nice sale prices too. Unfortunately, if you're in a small town or rural area, it's very difficult to find even an associate, let alone someone to buy your practice. So therefore, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, sound financial planning, financial management, that becomes even a more important ingredient, because you may not be able to rely on the sale of your dental practice at the kind of price you'd like to get to secure your financial future. So there's a lot of variables that have to be factored in there for sure. Now, some of you may attend one of my recent webinars on dental practice values. We're not going to reiterate the whole talk, but just as a review, because we're talking about selling to refresh your memories, the majority of dental practices in the private market, and by private market, I mean an individual doctor or doctors buys your practice as opposed to a corporate entity or DSO, okay? And so in the private sale world, we find that the value of practice as it relates to the prior year's gross receipts varies between 65 to 85%. This also applies to specialties, although specialties are a little bit lower. Again, everything is related to the market. So it's no surprise to see that some practices will go for even higher than that because of the demand. But this is just kind of a rule of thumb to give you an idea where it goes. Of course, if we go to an urban area, we're going to find a higher number versus a rural area where that number could be maybe 60% or less. Again, it's all supply and demand, but just so you know. And in a private sale, many valuators use different valuation approaches. Many, as we do, use 3 different approaches called the market, income, and asset approach. We look at practice through different lenses. We look at where it's located, comparable sales. We look at the profitability of the practice. We look at the value of the assets, whether it's new or old equipment. Is there a lot of technology? We take the 3 methods, and then we come up with an average of the 3, and that gives us a market or transactional value. However, and some of you may have already gone through this process, if you're talking to any type of corporate entity, they don't value practices that way. They use a financial term called EBITDA, which is defined as earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And unlike a private sale where you look at a sale price as a percentage of gross receipts, what we look to in an EBITDA valuation is a multiple of EBITDA. So for example, if EBITDA is $500,000, depending on the market, let's say that goes between 5 or 7, that's a value between 2.5 or 3.2, 3.5. So again, it's just a matter of who's purchasing you. And that's the kind of valuation methodology they like to use. So let's now get into the specifics about selling your practice. It's a time to make that decision. You know, it's going to be 2024 soon, as I said. So you got to get started if that's your goal to sell this coming year. However, there are some key questions that you need to answer before you start. And hopefully most of you have been doing this already. And please make sure you sit down with your accountant and financial advisor to get the ball rolling. And first of all, I always ask questions when I talk to doctors about their transition plans is, do you have a financial advisor or a financial planner? And have you ever gone through the financial planning process? It's a very comprehensive exercise. It's like getting a comprehensive physical. They look at everything under the sun to give you an idea of, you know, your assets and liabilities, how much you save, what is your age? If you're married, what's the age of your spouse? What is the projected lifespan? So 20 years ago, 80 years old was a good number. Now, a lot of financial planners are planning to 95 to 100 years old because of our healthcare system and people are just living longer, which means if you retire at the age of 60 and the planner says, well, you might be around for 30 more years, that's almost another career. So you can imagine the amount of assets you need to have to be able to enjoy your retirement. And that's really important. So also important is when you're ready to sell, why are you selling? Are you selling because you need the funds for your retirement? Or have you done well enough where whatever you sell it for is okay because you put a lot away, your asset base is strong, and all you want to do is enjoy your life and family and have freedom to travel and do other things, maybe another career or hobby, versus the sale of the practice. Every blessed nickel has to be acquired because you need that to continue your time in retirement. So that's very important, and also can have an impact on the timing of your transaction. You know, my career, I've worked with doctors who were excited about selling. They just wanted to get out of dentistry because they were tired, working with insurance companies and tired of staffing and everything else that a business owner deals with. But when they sat down with their accountant many times before financial planning became into vogue, accountant would say, "You crazy? You can't afford to do this. This is the kind of money you need." So sometimes doctors really had to change their plans. And if you go through this planning process, even though it may be painful, it's better to know whether you have a problem and maybe you have to hang around for a few more years to maybe enhance your practice's performance to get a higher value and be able to enjoy retirement. So those are very important things. And of course, obviously we have a bias for practice valuations, and have you had your practice valued? Obviously, if you're having a financial plan done, it's nice to know what your assets performance will be like with or without the sale of your dental practice. Another important question is, do you want to continue practicing? Okay. And if you do, especially in a private sale, how long do you anticipate practicing, right? And that's going to be really dependent on a number of things. Number one, depending on the size of your practice, are there enough patients for you to work even on a part-time basis after the sale? There may not be enough patients, so maybe you'll have to finish up some cases and you'll be done. Versus in a situation where maybe you had an associate or you're in a market where it's doing well, maybe you can stick around for a while because there's adequate patients. And more importantly, though, are you going to be compatible with the new owner? Now, where this isn't as much of an issue is where maybe you had an associate and maybe you're going to sell your practice to that associate versus you've been solo your whole life and now you're going to, maybe ask a company like ours to help you find a buyer that's compatible, who's going to purchase your practice. And now you have to make sure that you can coexist if you want to stick a while in practice. So those are important things that have to be considered. And if you're thinking about selling to a DSO, you've got to remember, as I said earlier, that it's not a walk away, meaning you're going to have to stick around for a period of time. Usually 3 to 5 years is a good a gauge. Sometimes you can negotiate that down, but that's important as far as your overall planning. Now, do you have an associate, or had you employed an associate? And is this particular individual, maybe they're only part-time, working at another location, and you're ready to go and you want to sell your practice to this doctor, and do you want them to purchase your practice? More importantly, do you have an employment agreement with a covenant, restrictive covenant in states that allow one? And why do I say that? Well, if in fact that associate you had doesn't have an agreement, doesn't have a covenant, and they don't want to buy your practice, but now you go out and find another doctor, and that doctor discovers that associate's around town, you're going to have a problem getting a maximum value on your practice because they could compete against them, right? Also, if you had an associate, maybe it might be easier to secure post-sale employment. Maybe there are some procedures that you're capable of doing that maybe if it's a younger doctor, they need some more mentoring. So that may make sense. But again, it goes back to having an adequate patient base. Now, for those of you who aren't quite ready yet to sell your practice, but maybe you had a practice valuation done recently, and the value wasn't where you wanted it to be, but you need to improve it. Well, do you know where you stand relative to industry standards? How does your overhead stack up, for example? Because that's a big one. Obviously, a practice that's highly profitable, keeps our overhead under control, is by and large going to get a higher value than a practice that has high overhead. That high overhead could be related to occupancy cost. It could be related to staff costs, long-term staff, lots of benefits, all those kinds of things. So again, the bottom line is when you buy a dental practice, you're not just buying dental equipment and a location, but you're really buying cash flow. So that's really a critical one. And of course, if you haven't made your mind up to sell, or you want to wait a while, we think it's a great idea to have a practice assessment. Just like a financial plan on your personal side, on the business side, have the practice assessed to see where there are strengths and weaknesses. And if there are weaknesses, bringing in talent to help you make those weaknesses go away, disappear. And if you're a general practitioner, one of the first things a consultant will look at is your recare system, because that's the lifeblood of a general practice. That's a lot of times, if it's a relationship-based practice where you get lots of referrals, it's just a good way, good, strong way. Now, admittedly, we have a problem in hiring good hygienists because we lost a lot of post-pandemic. So for some of you, you might not even be incentivized to stimulate your hygiene program because you can't find another hygienist. So I'm aware of that reality. But again, I still think it's something to measure and see if you can make some enhancements. How about your fees? In a practice assessment, you'd be able to do a fee study to find out where you stand on a UCR basis and whether some changes could be made. That's like giving yourself a raise, for sure. And most doctors are participating with insurance plans. And if you have quite a few insurance plans, has anyone ever analyzed your portfolio of plans and advised you, said, doctor, maybe this plan really isn't doing much for you. You're spending a lot of resources and you're not making much money. So those things can be assessed and analyzed, and I think it's a good idea. For some of you, you're not as good on collecting money, whether it's through insurance collections or just good old-fashioned cash management, and can you improve your cash flow with better AR management? How about on the technology scale? If you really haven't done much in technology, just buying technology doesn't mean you'll get a higher value, but it will enhance your opportunity to sell. And of course, if you're going to stick around for a few years and utilize the technology and benefit from it, then make that investment. And of course, social media, everybody finds a dentist a lot different than did back in the old days when they'd ask a friend, they just go online. So, how strong is your program? What type of program do you have? Do you have professionals working with your website and everything else that you're doing in a social media environment? So, as I said before, if you're thinking of selling your practice in 2024, it's not too late to get started. Typically, we find in most markets, 6 to 9 months is a good gauge to sell your practice from start to finish. Admittedly, if you're in an urban area, suburban area, highly popular, that number may be cut down dramatically. But I think just for planning purposes, you need to figure it out. Now, one of the things that when talking to doctors I had in my career, some of them give you a date. They want to retire on or about a certain date. Well, that sometimes doesn't work because it depends on that buyer out there that either you found or someone else found for you. And do they want to wait to your target date? So that's something you just need to keep in mind when you start this process, that someone may find you a viable candidate sooner than you expected. So you got to be prepared for that if that in fact does occur. So of course, looking at this overlay, the first thing, we need to do is get that practice valuation completed. And what does the market bear? What is the market value of that practice? And once that happens, then you start, looking for a candidate. And we're going to talk about whether you want to do it on your own, use your accountant or friend, or engage a broker. But when the process starts and people start looking at your practice, be prepared to give a lot of information because, when candidates are serious, they hire advisors and they want to do what's called due diligence. So they're going to look at a lot of information. So you shouldn't feel threatened or upset. They just need to know if they're going to go to a bank and borrow a lot of money, that investment that they're going to make in your practice is one that they can afford to do. And when you start looking at different candidates, there'll come a point in time, maybe you interviewed 5 or 6, or a broker has sent you a number of people, and some you like, some you don't, and you finally say, okay, give me something, give me a business offer to purchase. Let's put it in writing. So that's something that really starts to formalize the process so that people are serious, and that's an important element to get rolling. Then, of course, no sooner than you get the business offer to purchase, you're going to be required, if you're a buyer, to get financing if it's going to be a cash deal. So you've got to look at lenders, who's going to help you if you're the purchaser, select that lender, because, interest rates are changing. They're higher than they used to be, not as high as they were 20 years ago, but still today's generation, reasonably high. So that needs to be worked on at the same time. Of course, if you are a tenant, there are other issues depending on the length of your lease and whether or not there's going to be a problem. We'll chat about that in a few minutes. And as I said before, once you get that business offer to purchase and, you're really starting to formalize things, there's a lot of documentation, due diligence that is required to be done. So if you own a building or professional space, a condo, are you going to sell it with the practice? That's a decision you have to make. Sometimes a buyer is not interested in just buying your practice. They want the real estate too. Now, admittedly, interest rates are higher than they were a couple of years ago, double actually from almost a year ago. But if you put it in context, when I started in this business, interest rates were anywhere from 13, 14, 15, even 18% for home mortgages, believe it or not, back in the early 80s. So I'm dating myself, but it's important to put that in perspective because when I speak to younger doctors, they think it's a fairy tale, but it's really not. So in those days, it was pretty darn hard to do a deal, real estate and a practice sale at the same time. But interest rates are digestible, and certainly for many buyers, they'd rather pay down a real estate loan and build equity in that building and pay you rent. So that's something that has to be factored in. And of course, if you don't want to sell it for whatever reason, and maybe your financial planner feels that you need to get some retirement income, and if the buyers aren't really too upset about not buying the real estate, at least for the short term, and if you paid off the mortgage on the property, you get rental income, which that isn't so bad, particularly if you've been a solo practitioner and just been paying yourself a rent. So that's important as far as the overall equation. And of course, if the buyer wants to buy building at a point certain, then you negotiate a future purchase option. And usually that means an appraisal will be done at a future point in time, because who knows whether real estate values really go up or down. However, there may be an instance, and I've encountered this only a few times, where the property value is actually greater than the practice value. That could put you into some financing difficulties, and sometimes you might have to get a private investor to help along with making that investment if you're going to buy both simultaneously. Now, as the landlord, if you're going to offer that to your buyer, the length of the lease you're going to be offered must be identical to the number of years the practice acquisition loan. So if your buyer has a 10-year acquisition loan, then either a 10-year or 2 5-year year leases would be acceptable. And also, the rent that you charge has to be at fair market. If you own the building, many doctors sometimes never pay themselves a rent, or for financial planning purposes, tax purposes, they charge themselves an even higher rent. Now it's time when you're the landlord, so that rent has to be comparable to others in the area. Now, I referenced before, if you're a tenant, sometimes that can be a problem. One of the things that you'd like to have as a seller is having your lease being assigned to that buyer. And where that happens more often than not is when you know the landlord, maybe another professional in your community, someone local, somewhere where you could sit down and say, listen, I've been paying you rent for 25 years. I found this young doctor. He or she's great. They're in good shape financially. I'd like to assign the lease because I've got 4 years left of my existing lease. I don't want to have any obligations after settlement. So that's something you need to work on early, and you need to start negotiating it. Now, where it gets a little tenuous is if you're at the end of a lease and you maybe go to the landlord sooner than maybe you should, because maybe that landlord is going to get a little nervous thinking, who's going to replace it. Maybe they might try to find someone else to take your property. So again, it's just a matter of getting the timing down right. But of course, your lawyer will try to get you removed from the lease if you sell it, or if you're dealing more with a corporate landlord, chances are they're not going to give you a break unless you have some kind of great negotiating strategy. And so you may have to remain in the lease for the duration of the term, which is something you probably don't want, but that's a reality that you have to be aware of. And of course, if you're on that lease, you're still liable after that sale. So these are things that you just need to start factoring into your equation. So as you can begin to see, there's lots of things that we have to deal with in selling your practice. Let's talk for a minute about the current state of banks as far as dental lenders. The good news is they understand that the purchasers of today owe a lot of money. So I talked to many times, many selling doctors think, these doctors owe so much money. How could they get a loan? Yes, they can. As a matter of fact, they may even already have a mortgage. They're married, they have a child or two, whatever. And as long as they're good paying citizens with their student loans, then lenders understand the profile of the buyers of today. If they didn't loan money to these buyers, they'd be out of business as far as dental acquisition loans. That's where they make their money. And when I started in this business, lenders used to put a cap of about 65% on the coverage of value to debt, meaning if it was $1 million practice, no matter what we may have valued that, the most they would lend the doctor would be $650,000. And that usually had to include working capital. Well, things have changed dramatically. Now, most lenders are covering 90 to 100% of gross receipts. So $1 million, maybe a lender will loan you $1 billion, or loan a buyer $1 billion, or maybe 90% of that, and the other 10% goes to working capital. Again, the dental lending business is highly competitive, but at least now, because practice values are higher, lenders know that, and they want business. And the one thing about dental lending, the failure rate is really one of the lowest around. Unlike, people who own restaurants and other kinds of businesses where it's tough to stay afloat through business cycles, dentists seem pretty good at paying their bills, paying their rent, and paying their loans. So that's the good news, that they're willing to do it. Most lenders are going to look at 2 years of financial performance, and most loan rates now are vary between 6 to 7. Will they creep up a little bit? All depends on where interest rates go for the next year. Maybe they'll go a little bit higher in 2024. It's hard to say. But compared to where they were 20 years ago, where they were double digits, it's still a pretty good bargain. I know purchasers of today don't want to hear that because a few years ago, the rates were lower, but they're still reasonable loans when you amortize it over a period of years. However, higher risk loans, sometimes you have to go to a subprime lender, and interest rates could be close to double digit when there's some issues like that. And what lender underwriters look for is a debt to income ratio of 1.25. Now, some lenders do require a certain level of liquidity, and that's going to vary anywhere between 5 to 10% of the loan amount. Loan terms are usually 10 years, perhaps maybe 15 in certain circumstances, based on the size of the loan. And recently, some of our team has told us that they've seen a few lenders offering 66-month financing. Part of that might be due to the fact that they want to get a lower interest rate because the amount of risk of that loan is almost cut in half. And of course, if you're the buyer, if you're buying a practice that's highly profitable, has good cash flow, maybe you can buy into that program, but that's really very cash flow dependent. Another thing we have seen, because interest rates have been rising, when interest rates were kind of flat for a while, when a borrower goes out to get a loan, the bank will give what's called a rate lock, 60 to 90 days, where they'll say, okay, we're going to give this loan for 5.5 or 6%, whatever it may be. But after that, we, may have to look at things and the rate may go up. Well, we found this year particularly, we had some deals where things were kind of drug out and the rate lock expired and the interest rate went up, almost killing the deal. So it's important to keep the transactions moving in a timely manner, because if you have a rate lock expiration and the interest rate goes up and it goes up too much, you may lose your buyer, which would be really tragic. But that's just a hint to keep things moving on a fluid basis. We also are seeing a slight increase in seller promissory notes as part of the financing packages. This is a case where maybe there's a question about the doctor's production, service mix. Maybe there's something that they're a little bit concerned about with the practice. They're willing to loan, but maybe not 100%. So they want the seller to participate for a couple of years. So again, we've seen that a little bit more frequently than we have in the past. Let's talk for a minute about using practice broker. Some of you have worked with a practice broker. Some of you considering working with a practice broker. And at the end of the day, it's important to know that we're in the brokerage business as well as in the valuation business, that many practice sales are completed without a broker. Oftentimes, the doctor finds a buyer. Sometimes it could be through their accountant or attorney or friend, classmate, whatever it may be, and they move along and get the deal done. But oftentimes, based on what your personal circumstances are, it may be that you really like to sell sooner than later, and sometimes doing what we call for sale by owner might take a little bit longer because, you are looking at candidates and, you're trying to be discreet. You don't want to let your staff know you're looking to sell. So there's a lot of things there. But if you're looking at a timeline that's somewhat aggressive, then maybe a broker would be your best bet. At the end of the day, brokers charge a commission. We all know that. And the commission rates vary based on what you get for the services provided. And it's a personal situation where you have to measure the cost and benefit. If you do it all by yourself, it's on you. It's your time. What is your time worth? If you're really concerned about expediency and you just want to transact the business, it may be worth it to look at the brokerage commission as a transaction cost, just like when you sell a house. Most people sell a house through a broker. Once in a while, you get lucky and do it on your own. And in selecting a broker, there are brokers out there that represent both parties. By that I mean, they get paid by both. That's called dual representation. It's a fair question to ask to see, what your preference would be. So some companies that do this because they can keep the selling commission down and have the purchasers pay that commission. So again, it's just, when you do your due diligence, when you're interviewing brokers, that's something you have to ask yourself and see, would you rather have someone who's really getting paid only by the seller? So usually that's what a lot of doctors would prefer. But again, it's a personal decision. But no matter whether you use a dual represented broker or a broker who just represents the seller, one of the musts are confidentiality. And you can only imagine where if confidentiality gets breached, particularly in a specialty sale, that could be really a mess. So again, that's really important. And all brokers, that you sign confidentiality agreements, all brokers will have any purchasers that they work with sign what's called an NDA or non-disclosure agreement, which means that they cannot talk about the practice or anything about it, only with their immediate family or their advisors. Otherwise, they can get in trouble soon. Now, obviously, you go to a broker because of the timing issue, perhaps, because you don't want to do it on your own. So you're assuming that that broker that you're going to select has an inventory of qualified purchasers. People have come to them, they know who they are, they maybe worked with them in the past in deals that maybe didn't come to fruition, and they might even know their financial history if they've used banks before, coming back to the well another time. They also will have established relationships with the lenders, because for a young doctor to go out and put a loan package together, it's not that easy. And if time is of essence, you want to do it right, a broker is going to help you get that package done because they know what the lenders are looking for. And of course, why do you hire a broker? Well, you're under the impression that they have a knowledge of the local market conditions, because practice values vary all over the country, as I mentioned earlier. So your local broker knows what the banks are funding them at and what other practices that they sold are going for. So that's important. Now, when you work with a broker, you're going to be asked to sign a listing agreement, and that listing agreement can either be exclusive or non-exclusive. And so how long does that agreement sign for? Usually it's a year. Sometimes it might be less than a year. Rarely are listing agreements done for less than 6 months, although we have seen circumstances where we may take it for a shorter period of time, but usually expect about 1 year. Will there be a practice valuation? Is there a formal valuation or just an analysis with a financial projection? And will there be a charge or is it done for free? Other considerations in a listing agreement that are really a big deal are exclusions. So if you sign an exclusive listing agreement and you're the seller, you might want to exclude some people that you've spoken to before. Where non-exclusive means no names are listed, and it's almost like a free-for-all. Is your broker engaged? Do they find you the purchaser and really say, here's an accountant attorney to work with, and oh, by the way, what's the settlement date? I'll see you there, collect my money. Or do they become engaged? Are they going to provide sample closing documents, for example, practice purchase agreement, or if you're going to remain an employment agreement? Do they work with your advisors, with your CPA and attorney, and are they actively involved to kind of push the deal along? Because as I mentioned before, these things can really drag on, and if there's a rate lock issue there, timing is really critical. So there's a lot of moving parts, and someone needs to orchestrate it because everybody's busy, and sometimes the CPAs and attorneys don't necessarily, they don't work in sync, but it's kind of like one's handling the legal stuff, the other one's handling the financial stuff. And if the broker has the overview of everything, that's to your best interest. Okay. And so one of the reasons we like to provide agreements is that helps us maintain control of the transaction to make sure the deal gets done and our seller gets to the closing table in the best time possible. Also, brokers should assist purchasers in obtaining financing. As I mentioned before, if they know the lenders, there's no reason why they wouldn't. So when we're really getting down to the serious nature of things, we now have to start looking at agreements. And we're going to talk about a couple things that are important to know about in the purchase agreement, or what's called alternatively an agreement of sale. One of the first things that the practice purchase agreement is going to mention, and I'll talk about the tax side of things in a minute or two, is allocation of the purchase price. Accounts receivable typically are not part of a practice's value, nor is cash, nor liabilities. So that's a separate asset. And so in many cases, that money is rightfully owned by the seller. How is it going to be collected? How is it going to be paid? Is there going to be any transaction costs for doing the work, collecting the outstanding accounts receivable? Now, sometimes purchasers would rather buy the AR so they don't have to worry about that. And you just negotiate an appropriate price with discounting based on the age of the receivable. What about credit balances? Somebody's paid for something they didn't receive. That's got to be dealt with and taken care of because that could create a problem. And some states have laws that are can be very punitive with credit balances. Disposition of work in progress. Are there any cases that need to be finished? And if they are, how does it affect the former owner? Do they come to the practice? Are there lab charges? Things that have to be negotiated. They need to be listed out. How about staff? If you're going to be keeping most of the staff, are there any unused vacation time and benefits, unfunded pension liabilities? All that good stuff needs to be taken care of. In the unlikely event that there is any remakes on services provided by the selling doctor, what contingencies are there for those to be remedied? Usually it's only for 1 year post-treatment. And of course, question is whether the seller or the buyer performs the services, and how is the seller, if anything, compensated, or do they compensate the buyer? How about family care protocol? How many family members can be treated without charge? Again, those are things that need to be discussed. Any contingencies? There may be some peculiarities of the deal where there's some financial risk, so therefore asking for some type of money in escrow is not at all inappropriate, but needs to be negotiated. And of course, is the seller going to be retained, and for how long, how much? Things of that nature need to be looked into. This is just a small portion of what we call a pre-closing checklist. Obviously, you can see there's a lot of information in there, but there's so many small items that need to be dealt with. Taking it just from simple things like bank accounts, payroll processing, setting up different kinds of accounts for lab, dental supplies. But what about all the other important things? Writing letters to patients, any kind of machinery that needs to be transferred over. You name it, lots of things. So that's a document that we give both parties, and we have them work on it together in instances. And of course, insurance credentialing is also important relative to how you participate in plans. We've seen some deals get delayed because the associate wasn't credentialed, because they waited too long, and now we have a problem in how everybody gets paid. So again, those are things, just a myriad of things that just need to be looked into. And obviously, in a 1 hour webinar, we don't have time to cover all those, but suffice to say, there are a lot of things. But briefly, taxes have to be paid in the sale of a dental practice. And in most dental practice sales, they're classified as asset sales. So the tangible assets are equipment, inventory, sometimes leaseholds if it's a tenant situation. Intangible assets, obviously, the majority of it is goodwill. There's a restrictive covenant that needs to be written in the deal. There's a patient list that's transferred, and sometimes a phone number is also transferred. That's particularly important in specialty practices. So it's give and take, just like anything else, as far as the tax treatment. The seller wants to maximize the capital gains treatment. They want to pay the least amount of tax possible. And the purchaser wants to write things off so they can reduce their taxable liability. So what are some of the common tax allocation items? Well, obviously, goodwill is considered a capital gain. That's beneficial. And that's usually 75 to 80, maybe even 85% based on the asset mix in the practice of the value is relegated to goodwill. So most of the times the doctor is getting a pretty nice chunk of capital gains in the sale of their dental practice. Equipment and supplies, restrictive covenant, and deferred comp. Sometimes that's used. Those are all ordinary income items. Write-offs for the buyer, but ordinary income for the seller. The patient list is also capital gains. Sometimes advisors and deals want to have a consulting agreement with the seller. That's an ordinary income item, as well as leaseholds. And depreciation we capture only relates to the seller. Perhaps they bought some equipment a year or two before the sale. They did some aggressive tax write-off, like a 179, some income tax due based on the tax code. So again, that's something more on the seller's side. Now for the purchaser, obviously, the majority of the deal and asset sale is going to be goodwill, and the purchaser can write that off over 15 years. Equipment could be 5 to 7 years or less based on how the accountant wants to allocate those assets. Restricted covenant is 15 years, patient list, and the consulting agreement, 1 year. Leaseholds are for the remaining term and supplies for a year. So again, it's just a balanced approach. Usually these things can be handled pretty amicably, but it just needs to be dealt with. Now, I'm just going to close just for a minute or two for those of you who maybe are in an area or in a situation where you can't sell your practice as a going concern, meaning you're at your location, your equipment, everything in place, somebody buys everything, but for whatever reason, it's not going to work that way. This we encountered a lot during COVID times where we had a lot of doctors for obvious reasons didn't want to go back. We did a lot of these types of sales where doctors were just selling their patient records to another practice in the area. So if you're in that boat, this is one of the ways that it can be handled. It's called a production acquisition valuation method. And basically what that means is you, the seller, gets a payment of fixed a percentage of income or revenue from any of the seller's patients. Usually it's over a 2 to 3 year period. And it's one where, unfortunately, the seller is taking the majority of the risk. Again, you're buying future performance of the seller's patients. So usually we require a down payment, usually 10 to 15, maybe 20% of the agreed upon sale price. Sometimes we try to get a higher value for our doctors in these types of deals only because the real risk is with the seller, not the buyer, because that seller is not getting much money up front. It's paid for over time. So we try to get them a higher number. And if they get the higher number, what does that mean? That means that a lot of patients did rightfully transfer over to that buyer, and everybody wins. Typically, the payments are paid quarterly, and the seller usually has an option for an annual audit to make sure things are done accordingly. And as I said before, if the purchaser pays the maximum value, it's a big win for everybody. Another way of doing this is an individual record purchase, where you might look at the last 2 to 3 years of receipts, divide that through by the number of patients who have had one patient visit over the last 18 months. You come up with a per record fee, and you pay that over a 24-month period. Usually that record fee is paid on the second visit. Again, hopefully most of you won't have to be relegated to this type of sale, but at least it's better than back in the old days when somebody would sell their practice legacy for $5,000 with the patient records being transferred to their friend. We try to get our sellers some type of financial reward for their career. So, covered a lot of ground today. I hope that you found this to be of interest and maybe stimulate some thinking, maybe even motivate you if you're thinking of 24 as your big year to get started right away. So when will you really begin your practice transition? If you have any related questions, please reach out to us at henryschein.dpt.com, dpt@henryschein.com, and our number's there, 800-988-5674. So I want to thank you for joining me today. You found this to be a great benefit, and enjoy the rest of the year 2023, and good luck in 2024.